So, ladies and gentlemen, on this Easter Sunday, we want to wish everybody a happy weekend. I know it's been a rough weekend in New Brunswick with all the flooding, but we're going to take a little time out here to look at probably one of the biggest, if not the biggest, religious dramas of all time. Now, the Ten Commandments as a film has basically been analyzed, studied, broken down, looked at in many, many different ways because of the various tropes and the various Cecil B. DeMille type of large scale production. But in 2019, it's 63 years later, it still stands out as probably the only movie that was could have been made in the old studio system. Now, it was produced, directed, and narrated by Cecil B. DeMille. Imagine in the modern era Steven Spielberg. Cecil B. DeMille at one point was 10 times the creator, the producer, the director, the motivator that Spielberg ever was. He basically was at the forefront of the big screen movies we see now. He was well ahead of his time, and this movie was not only filmed in VistaVision with the Technicolor color and released by Paramount, it went above and beyond in bringing forth the story of the Ten Commandments as presented by Moses in the Bible. Now, the film is based on Prince of Egypt by Dorothy Clark Wilson, Pillar of Fire by J.H. Ingraham, On Eagle's Wings by A.E. Southan, and the Book of Exodus. Now, for those who are listening to this who've never heard of Moses or are non-Christians, we'll give you the basic breakdown. It dramatizes the biblical story of the life of Moses, who's an adopted Egyptian prince of Jewish background, who becomes the deliverer of his fellow Jews, the enslaved Hebrews, of course, and therefore leads the Exodus to Mount Sinai, where he receives from God the Ten Commandments. Now, this takes about 4 hours of screen time because there's a lot going on because of the all-star cast and the all-star breakdown in the movie. The great Charlton Heston has the lead role with Yul Brynner as Ramesses, Ann Baxter as Nefertiti, Edward G. Robinson as Dathan, Yvonne DiCarlo as Sephora, Deborah Paget as Lilia, John Derek as Joshua. Actually, my brother Joshua is named after Derek's character in the movie. And the great Sir Cedric Hardwicke as Sethi, Nina Foch as Bithia, Martha Scott as Yoshebel, Judith Anderson as Memnet, and again the great Vincent Price as Baca. Now the celebrity cast here, where we came from all kind of dramatic background, and the scenes, although some of them are so over top and so sexual and so, dare I say, horny, uh, is all a matter of perspective. Now, if any Christian watches the movie, they're noticing probably right away that Cecil B. DeMille, it was a little bit over the top, the way of the sexuality of Moses with his Nefertiti. Anne Baxter character spends most of her time professing her, I don't know, sexual desires for Moses. But that's expected 1950s biblical epic. You had a lot of stuff going on. Cecil B. DeMille would provide enough of a biblical aspect and the kind of straightforward, I don't know, draws of the time. Beautiful women, beautiful men, great sets, great costumes, and all that. Now, it was filmed on location in Egypt, Mount Sinai, and the Sinai Peninsula. And it was DeMille's swan song because it was his last and most successful work after being many decades leading the way in Hollywood. Uh, to many scholars of Cecil B. DeMille, they see it as kind of a remake of his 1923 silent film, the same title. And although I've seen both movies, there is some parallels, but again, the romanticism and the horniness of of the Ten Commandments, 1956, there's no comparison. Even now in 2019, it's like, what the heck's going on here? This is supposed to be a religious epic, and you have like this trying to create the sexual tension between a lot of characters in the movie. I mean, there's even S&M, parallels, all kind of crazy stuff. Anyway, we're not going to that because it's getting off topic. But one of the largest ever sets created for a film with the largest ever cast was featured in a movie, and you can see it with the parting of the water scene, the Ten Commandments presentation scene, the the Mount Sinai where they reject God and reject Moses, and you have all this debauchery going on. Took a lot to put all together. Now, when it was released on November 8, 1956, it was considered the most expensive film of all time. Now, some reports say the movie in modern times would have cost $400 million. I think that's pretty well what you expect. But returns on it were quite successful. But it's according to the Guinness World Book of Records. In terms of theatrical exhibition, remember at the time, 25 cents to 75 cents to a dollar in 1956, adjusted for inflation, is the seventh most successful film of all time. Now, it was nominated for 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, and it won Academy Award for Best Visual Effects. And Heston, of course, got a Golden Globe nomination for Best Performance as an Actor. Now, Yul Brynner, who actually had a great year, who also is one of his biggest years ever. He was in Anastasia and The King and I during that year. He won the National Board of Review Award for Best Actor because it is one of his greatest years of all time. Um, Now, the gross at the time was 122.7 million. Even now, that would be very impressive, but you're going to multiply that. It would be comparable to maybe a $3 billion movie now because, prices have gone up through the roof. Now, in 1995 and 1999, actually, the film was selected for preservation in the United States National Film Registry by the Library of Congress. Um, Now, the AFI called it in one of its polls, actually June 2008, a top 10 movie of all time, and it was a top 10 epic for sure. Now, network television in Canada states has aired the film in prime time during the Passover Easter season every year since 1973. It didn't show up on Canadian TV this year, except for CHCH, CTV, and CTV2 decided so was Sound of Music, which is totally bizarre because Sound of Music more of a Christmas movie. But for many people, Ten Commandments is your sit down, you have your Easter supper, whatever. After you go to church, you put the movie on, and you just play it in the background because it's that over the top, but that religious in many aspects. Now, to go over the plot would take too long. Basically, Moses is abandoned by his mother because there was a scourge on the firstborn Jews of Egypt, and he's saved by the daughter of Pharaoh. Moses is brought up as one of the one of the successors for the then Pharaoh, played by Cedric Hardwicke, and eventually he finds out he's actually a Jew, and then he becomes the Moses of the biblical side. But like, there's a lot of stretching of the Bible story of Moses, a lot of stretching of the various characters, and it's 4 hours of all kind of twists and turns and romantic entanglements and John Derek with no shirt on and all kind of. There's a lot going on here. Now, the DeMille was very, very. This was his passion project, as we say. Now, even though these some coincidences in production to Moses' life, now it's it just basically Moses the character in the Bible and Moses the character in the movies. Obviously, there's a very, very tenuous connection, but the music, the art direction, the presentation, everything else, it just tremendous. It just stands up in a lot of ways. Now, the New York Times basically said that in the first release, in its remarkable settings and decor, including an overwhelming facade of the Egyptian city from which the Exodus begins, and in the glowing technicolor which a picture is filmed, Mr. DeMille has worked photographic wonders. Now, the cast was just tremendous. Yul Brynner outacts Charlton Heston in this movie, but he mostly does what every movie he's in. But it if you're a Christian, you're watching the movie, you got to say good try, Cecil B. DeMille, but it's not really. It's not. It's just so over the top. Like I said, I can't say there's enough. I've watched the movie about 45, 50 different times over the years, and according to a very, very prominent movie critic, he said critics have argued in this case of a very famous critic, I'm not sure who it is, that considerable liberties were taken with the biblical story of Exodus, compromised the film's claim to authenticity, but neither this nor For Our Lent has really has an impact on its popularity. Uh, but it was actually Ten Commandments been used by Christian churches throughout the globe as a fundraiser for the facilities. Now, millions of people have gone to these what do you call revivalist church fundraisers, and that's good. Where some church locations have benefited from seeing it. Now, the ratings for Ten Commandments have been pretty steady over through the years, especially on ABC. The range in the 4 to 7 million range, and a lot of people. This is an old standard like A Wonderful Life at Christmas, which has Christian overtones as well. Um, Usually, now in 2010, this would have change happened. There's a 6K version that was restored that what's been shown on television lately. Because back in the day before the 6K, you had some really terrible Ten Commandments copies. Basically, they almost look like old-fashioned VHS. Now, as it stands right now, it is in the Vista Vision aspect ratio on most of the what do you call the style. This division is a very interesting process because it is widescreen, but it's more like a 3D aspect. It's very multicolored. It's like 16 to 32 color separation, and it it's almost like they were predicting the high definition we see now with this movie, because with the big screens that we see now, which are very inexpensive, upwards of 48 to 64 inches, the Roku smart TVs and stuff like that. I think the VistaVision was ahead of its time, and for that alone, it is the first really high definition movie. It's not only high definition, it's basically its aspect ratio makes it that good. And if you have a great TV and a great receiver and a great color palette, it's something to enjoy. Now, do I recommend the Ten Commandments to non-Christians? Well, I recommend every person watch a movie that's been respected throughout the years, even though you may not believe in God or whatever. That's your choice. But like for a lot of people, they've gotten joy and solace from the Ten Commandments. My Aunt Valerie, especially, who's been a big fan of the movie as long as I can remember. Actually, this podcast is dedicated to her. My mother was a big fan of it because, when you name one of your children after John Derrick, who was, a competent actor, but he was much better with his shirt off, anything else. But it was a movie of his time. I mean, you got Elvis's ex-girlfriend in there, Deborah Paget. You got Yvonne DiCarlo. You have Vincent Price. It's got Edward G. Robinson, of all people. Yeah, where's your savior now, Shay? Edward G. Robinson just chews up scenery, and I think what happened, he should get a Best Supporting Actor nomination for this movie. He was ripped off. I mean, his Dathan is just completely, reprehensible character, like the epitome of evil. And John Carradine's in this too, and it just so many connections to old time cinema with the modern cinema. There are a few actors in the movie that are still living, of course, and they could probably tell you the same. But it stood the test of time. In 2019, we're still talking about it, 63 years later, and there's been animated versions and different knockoffs, and there's been parodies, especially on The Simpsons, the famous episode where Moses comes down and Homer figures out that Homer's ancestor can't survive because he's broken already all of the commandments before he's even come down. But I think my God is a loving God, and God could make a decision about this. Hey, it's Cecil B. DeMille. What did he expect? Because he was over the top. There's a famous line in Hollywood: "I must have killed more men than Cecil B. DeMille in Blazing Saddles." You don't say that for nothing. Everything was in the movie. There was these famous movies he did in the past where basically people were almost drowned and burned alive in these sets. Obviously, that's not the best way to film a movie. But I mean, if you look at the Ten Commandments, everything he possibly could throw at the screen was up there, because he had stars, he had presents, he had special effects. The special effects in this are great. Remember seeing it at the Bar Drive-In in the beautiful outdoor area of the North Shore near the Bay of Chaleur, and the sounds and the visuals, even at a drive-in, is tremendous. The movie stands out because it predicted everything that would come now. You look at the Avengers, you look at all these superhero movies, these large 6K to 4K to 6K presentations. It all starts here. That was the yardstick because it made so much money and had so much of an impact. People were demanding movies like Ten Commandments, even the bad knockoffs, Barabbas and King of Kings, and even Ben Hur. With no Ten Commandments, would be no Ben Hur because it had that biblical style and all kind of stuff. Even the greatest story ever told, and the Bible, and all that. And there's been maybe a million movies over the years have ripped off Ten Commandments, and that's what you're going to do. Now, is it on my top 50 movies of all time? Yes. Is it in the top 40? No. Because I have a big problem with a movie that uses Anne Baxter as seductress for Moses, the savior of the Jewish people. They could have chose somebody else, but Anne Baxter, from an aspect, she's like a 3-star actress. You could have got somebody better. I have difficulty how Vincent Price was wasted in the movie. I have difficulty how Edward G. Robinson outacted everybody in the movie. I had some difficulty with John Derrick as a himbo being the leader like Moses number 2. Deborah Paget, stuff like that. Some really strange characters, but when it works. But the Edward G. Robinson scenes, I mean, you could do even a sequel. That should have been interesting. Maybe you should have done a prequel just with the Edward G. Robinson character, but neither here or there. It's the Ten Commandments. It's a big movie. Shut up. Say like Little Richard. So on this, rainy Easter Sunday, we wish you the best. And as is looking right now, Toronto still hasn't finished off the Boston Bruins. And if you want to have a successful Easter, you Toronto fans, you better start praying now because if it goes to Game 7, no more Babcock in Toronto. Anyway, have a great day. Keep your stick in the ice. Bye.